各位朋友，大家上午好！欢迎各位参加由 Mentoring 导师学院和欧洲导师与教练协会联合主办的100场导师技术在线论坛。今天是第35场，由来自美国的 Fain 女士主讲。她给我们分享的主题是在导师辅导过程中，我们如何去弥合差异，然后能从中学习并加以利用，然后能实现更高效的导师辅导。首先，让我们来认识一下今天的主讲嘉宾 Fain。Fain 她最初的背景呢，她是一位法律博士，她曾经在一家大型跨国律师事务所担任律师。那后来呢，她开始转型做教练，也是在全球各地都做了很多的演说。然后她特别擅长的是将文化能力和导师辅导然后相结合的这么一个主题。她现在是国际导师协会 IMA 的会长，同时也创办了 Vista Coaching， 他同时也是 Center for Mentoring Excellence 的首席执行官。那他在近几年呢，也写了几本关于导师辅导的书籍，有其中一本是导师指南，然后另一本呢就是跟今天的主题密切相关的，是关于差异的问题。这两本书呢都有售，然后大家感兴趣的话可以去查找一下。今天的讲座主办方是欧洲导师与教练协会和 Mentoring 导师学院。欧洲导师与教练协会简称 EMCC， 是总部设在比利时布鲁塞尔的专门为导师与教练提供国际资格认证的非营利性组织。那我们 EMCC Global 它全球的公众号现在也已正式开放，大家可以扫右方的2维码关注我们的这个动态。Mentoring 是一家总部位于比利时布鲁塞尔的全球化导师服务咨询公司。我们的业务遍及6大洲35个国家和地区。那我们提供的导师技术课程、服务流程标准以及服务团队都获得了 EMCC 的专业认证。Mentoring 中国是注册在上海的中国合资企业。在2019年的11月，我们首次把欧洲导师技术正式引入中国。Now let's warmly welcome Ms. Fain。好，现在邀请我们的演讲嘉宾，欢迎。
Hi, I'm Fain, CEO of Center for Mentoring Excellence. We work with organizations all around the world to help them create more inclusive and better cultures through mentoring. I'm so excited to talk to you today about a topic that I'm extremely passionate about, which is bridging differences for better mentoring, creating change one relationship at a time. We'll talk today about how you create relationships, how you create mentoring relationships where you can invite conversations about difference. If you were to ask me if I were to have spent my career in mentoring earlier in my career, I would have laughed and been pretty doubtful about that. You see, my first experience with mentoring was when I was a young associate just out of law school. I was at a large law firm in Chicago, Illinois as a young associate. Although it is less true then, at the time, there were very few senior women attorneys. And so my law firm decided to create a mentoring program. Note that I use air quotes because what they call a program, I now call pair and pray, meaning let's pair people and just pray that it succeeds. So at the time I was assigned to a senior woman attorney, and her instruction to me was to mentor me, which meant to take me out to lunch every month. So out to lunch we went. We went to great restaurants. We had great meals and wonderful conversation. And we talked about a lot of things. But what didn't we talk about? Well, we didn't talk about my fears as an attorney, my questions about this profession that I was entering, or anything about what it was that made me excited, where my strengths were, where my fears were. And so at the end of the mentoring year, the program administrator came around and asked for feedback. And I remember very clearly my response to her was, mentoring is delicious. And it was delicious. It was delicious because we had great meals and delicious conversation, but it was not developmental. And so it wasn't truly mentoring. What I want to talk to you about today is the transformational power of mentoring, because when I had a mentor who really took interest in me, where we could have conversations about where my strengths were, where my talents were, and where I could succeed, I really saw the power of transformational mentoring. So I'm excited to talk to you today about how to create transformational mentoring by inviting conversations about difference into your mentoring relationship. So first, before we get started, there are many different forms of mentoring. There's formal mentoring and informal mentoring. And today we're going to talk mostly about formal mentoring. There's also lots of different constructions. Typically, when we think about mentoring, we think about one-on-one mentoring, meaning one mentor to one mentee. And most traditionally, we think about a more senior person mentoring somebody more junior. Typically, when people are talking about mentoring, this is the formation that they have in mind. And there's a lot of benefits to that. We'll talk about some of them. And usually it is somebody who is more senior who is sought out as a mentor. But more and more, what we are seeing in organizations is what I call complementary mentoring. Complementary, meaning that both sides bring something to the relationship and that what each brings enhances the other. This is a term that I use to describe what many people call reverse mentoring, where somebody who is more junior mentors somebody who is more senior. And the idea here is that the more senior mentee, the more senior employee, the more senior individual gets additional generational perspective, maybe even perspective from a minority group or a group that's been underrepresented in the workplace, and learns different perspectives on the workforce, gets a confidant in a very different way, and that the more junior mentor gets exposure to somebody who is more senior, and really learns more about the business as well. And we're seeing a lot of interest and impact from complementary mentoring. So those are both forms of one-on-one mentoring. There's also one-to-many. What does that mean? One mentor to many mentees. Sometimes several mentees, mentors to many mentees as well. And there's lots of different formations of that. Here are just a few. Group mentoring. Group mentoring when there is one or two mentors to a group of mentees, and there's typically topical conversations, but the mentee's job is to show up for one another and to show up for their own learning needs with the mentor. Peer mentoring, this is where you will have a mentor and a mentee, and those might be in the same person. So you have each member of the circle, they are peers, and they may both take on a mentor and a mentee role. Of course, you could have one-on-one peer mentoring as well. And finally, mentoring circles. Mentoring circles, often you have rotating mentors for a group of mentees. And again, these are typically topical conversations as opposed to goal-oriented conversations for each of the mentees. All serve different needs, all require clarification that they are mentoring. And we'll talk about the definition of mentoring in a moment. First, I want to talk about the different roles and how mentoring differs from coaching and how being a supervisor differs from being a mentor. So let's start with the difference between mentoring and coaching. Very frequently, I get a question, what is the difference between a mentoring and coaching? And the answer is that they are sisters. They're very closely related and often overlap, but there is a difference. Mentoring is typically focused on development. It is a voluntary formation that's future focused and sometimes focused on intangibles. There's a range of learning opportunities. And as I just mentioned, it of course can take many forms. The key distinction here is that mentoring in its best and truest form is something that is mentee directed. The mentee drives the relationship. The mentor may or may not be familiar with the work of the mentee. I've seen incredibly successful mentoring relationships where the mentor does not have work experience in the area in which the mentee works. But the idea is that the mentee directs the learning and the mentor brings their experience, their wisdom, their curiosity, and all in the interest of the mentee's development. How is that different from coaching? Well, coaching is usually very present focused. It is often contractual. There is less reciprocity in a coaching relationship. The process is most frequently driven by the coach. There are some elements of coaching where the process is driven by the coachee or the client, but the coach brings the tools in a coaching relationship, and there is not the same reciprocity. And most frequently, coaching is a short-term relationship that focuses on boosting performance in some way. That's the difference between mentoring and coaching. Indeed, there is a lot of overlap as well. And I know there's a lot of experts watching this webinar who may have additional or differing opinions on that as well. Now, the difference between a supervisor and a mentor is an important one. It's not that a good supervisor doesn't have mentoring skills. In fact, the best supervisors will have the ability to have mentoring conversations with the people whom they supervise. But if you're seeking out a mentor, I often advise people not to seek out a mentor who is their supervisor. Why? Because ultimately the supervisor's interest is the interest of the performance of the team, the performance of their employee in their day-to-day job. And in mentoring, when we're focusing on development, it may be that what's in the interest of the mentee is not the same as what's in their current role. Additionally, the best practices of mentoring require vulnerability and sharing and a laboratory and a sounding board and a safety net, a place where the mentee can share their weaknesses and work on their weaknesses. And that's very difficult to do if the person with whom you're sharing is also evaluating your performance. So therein lies some differences between supervisor and mentor. Now, there's another difference that I want to highlight for you, and that's the difference between mentoring and sponsoring. There's some wonderful books out there that talk about sponsoring, some even that say that you need to have a sponsor and not a mentor. I don't think it's an or, I think it's an and here's why. It's critical to have a mentor, somebody who is focused internally to the relationship, where the role requires guidance and connection and vulnerability. It is helpful in a mentoring relationship to share your challenges, as I just mentioned, to focus on how to get better at the things that you're good at and how to get better on the things you're not so good at, and how to share your challenges and fears and worries, and even your shortcomings, because the purpose is development. In a sponsoring relationship, a sponsor is somebody who will advocate for somebody who is not in the room. The focus is external to the relationship. The role requires advocacy and championship and influence. And rather than it being helpful to share your challenges, it's helpful to show stellar performance in a sponsoring relationship, because the purpose is career advancement. So very often I'll suggest to people, get a mentor with whom you can work on development so you can show up for your sponsor as the person for whom they will want to advocate, who they will want to champion, for whom they will want to exercise their influence, and so that you can show stellar performance for your sponsor. Therein lies the difference between mentoring and sponsoring. Okay, let's dig in a little bit more. What makes mentoring so special? Well, there are 3 characteristics of mentoring that I think distinguish it from these other modalities. I live here in the United States, in the Pacific Northwest, where there's lots of hiking, so I love a good hiking metaphor. And as you can see here, I want to ask you to imagine the mentor as a compass, a guide on the side, and the mentee as a hiker or a seeker. And with these 3 characteristics, the mentor is able to guide the mentee. And here are those 3 characteristics. Number 1, reciprocity. In mentoring relationships, mentors give and mentors get. We know from both anecdotally and from the data that in most mentoring relationships, mentors gain as much, sometimes even more than mentees. In fact, they gain better leadership skills, they enhance their perspectives, they get the satisfaction of giving back in the relationship. But also they enhance their own skills and their perspectives, and they become better leaders and better at their job, and renew and reinvigorate their sense of meaning and purpose in their role as a result of their mentoring. So what mentors gain is quite a lot. And mentees, of course, gain career guidance, they gain perspective, they are able to get additional insight and support, among many other things, through the mentoring relationship. So there's the idea of reciprocity, that mentors and mentees give and get in the relationship. Second is the idea of co-creation. I like to say that in a one-on-one mentoring relationship, there's actually 3 things to consider. 1 + 1 = 3. What do I mean? Well, the 3 things to consider in a mentoring relationship are the mentor, the mentee, and then the relationship that the mentor and the mentee co-create together. You see, one of the things that makes mentoring unique is that the mentor and the mentee can negotiate the terms of their relationship. They can set the parameters of their relationship in a way that co-creates it and sets them up for success. So that's reciprocity and co-creation. And the third and perhaps the most important characteristic of a mentoring relationship is learning. I want you to remember that learning is the purpose, the process, and the product of a mentoring relationship. I'm going to say that one more time. Learning is the purpose, the process, and the product of a mentoring relationship. Without learning, you just have a delicious relationship, like my first mentoring relationship that I mentioned. So it's really important to remember that learning is essential to successful mentoring. Now, when I was leading diversity, equity, and inclusion for a publicly traded company here in the US, I loved that job. I loved knowing that I was working to create a better workforce for everybody, where everybody could feel included. But I did have a growing sense of frustration. You know, there's lots of commitment to mentoring, there's lots of commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace today. And in fact, to this date, companies have spent more than $6 billion with a B, US dollars on diversity training and diversity programs. So if a commitment to diversity, and indeed companies have also said 90% of CEOs say that they have a personal and a professional commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion as a strategic priority. So if that intention and that investment were enough to move the needle to become an inclusive workplace, we would have seen more change by now. But here's the problem, and this aligns with the frustration that I felt when I was leading diversity, equity, and inclusion. People come to diversity training, or they come to the roundtable discussions, or they even come to the strategic discussions, and they leave with energy and excitement to create a more inclusive work environment. But then they go back to their workspaces, they go back to the land of the status quo, and they stay in their silos, and they lose momentum. And so it seems like there are shark-infested waters between the land of status quo and the land of inclusion. And even though people have made the investment and have the intention, they're waiting for somebody to come and lead them to the land of inclusion to have a more inclusive workplace. But that is not the way it works. It's not the way it works. In fact, in order to get to the land of inclusion, you have to take action. And we know that mentoring is inclusion in action. So let's just take a pause for a second and talk about why inclusion is so important. You may have heard, and you may believe, that more diverse teams, more diverse environments lead to better work environments. And indeed, that is true, but it's only true sometimes. In fact, what we know is that sometimes multicultural teams will overperform monocultural teams, but there are times when multicultural teams will underperform. So what makes the difference? Well, when leaders, even if you have a multicultural team with lots of difference, when leaders ignore or suppress cultural differences become an obstacle to performance. But when leaders acknowledge and support cultural differences will become an asset to performance. And so it is inclusion that enables leaders to acknowledge and support cultural difference. It is inclusion where cultural differences are recognized as an asset to performance. And I tell you, I believe that mentoring is indeed inclusion in action. So here's what we know. In order to get to the land of inclusion, it requires action and behavior. You can't just go back to your silos, back to the status quo, and expect intention and investment to be enough to get you to the land of inclusion. It requires action and behavior. And that action and behavior is mentoring. Indeed, studies have shown that more than any other diversity initiative, mentoring is shown to achieve inclusion through representation at the management level of traditionally underrepresented employees. So I want to talk to you about that action and behavior today. There are 3 pillars of action and behavior that will help you bridge differences in your mentoring relationship. And those are leaning forward, learning, and leveraging difference. Leaning forward into difference, learning from difference, and leveraging difference. Let's talk first about leaning forward into difference. What I want you to know is that in order to lean forward into difference, it requires that you create ownership and you accept responsibility. Create ownership and accept responsibility for what? Create ownership for bridging differences. Create ownership for recognizing that it is everybody's responsibility to invite conversations about difference, to create a sense of belonging. It is not somebody else's. It is not the responsibility of the other. And in fact, in order to fully accept responsibility and create ownership, you need to remember this. Differences lie between people, not within them. Differences lie between people, not within them. This means that no one person is inherently different from the other. We are all different from one another. And if you think about it that way, you will recognize that it is each of our responsibilities and all of our responsibilities to bridge differences, to make sure that we've created a sense of belonging where people feel included and valued and seen. So that's that's leaning forward into difference. I want to talk to you about learning from difference. Learning from difference is about creating awareness. And before you think about it as creating awareness of your mentoring partner, the first step is actually creating a sense of self-awareness, of awareness of your own identity, of your own culture, of your own privilege and your own bias, so that you can begin to notice the differences between you and others and to use those differences, to value those differences as an asset. So a lot of people feel uncomfortable when I say to notice the differences and to value the differences, and they say, why can't we just talk about the ways that we are in common? Why can't we just talk about our shared values and our shared motivation? Well, talking about commonality is important and is valuable, but it doesn't have to be that we value that we value each other despite our differences. We can value each other because of our differences. And I love this quote by the architect Charles Ames. He said, "The details are not the details. They make the design." This is true in architecture, and it's true in human architecture. It's true for human beings as well. So the first step is to recognize the details. And that really does require self-awareness. It's very rare that we take the time to think about what makes us, us. What makes me, me. What makes you, you. So I want to invite you to think about your identity as an iceberg. Think about the iceberg. Every element on this iceberg is something that impacts the way you view the world and the way the world views you. And like an iceberg, there's only a small amount over the waterline, right? Let's say maybe less than an eighth of the iceberg is visible above the line of the water that people can identify what it is. And there's 7/8, let's say, below the waterline of invisible traits. So I want you to think about your own identity as an iceberg. And to help you do that, I'm going to use myself as an example. If we were to use my iceberg, we'll call this my cultural iceberg or my identity iceberg. And I were to ask you, what are the traits that you see above the waterline that are visible to you, that you either can see or hear or notice just by listening to this webinar, watching this webinar for the full 20 or so minutes that I've been speaking so far? And you might say things like you have short dark hair, or you talk very quickly and with your hands, or we notice you speak English as a native speaker. We notice you have light skin. If we were in person, you might notice that I'm quite short. All of these things are visible, and you have made assumptions about me. I will even say you've made judgments about me in this short time that we've been acquainted based on those limited things that you see above the waterline. Below the waterline are all sorts of other characteristics of things that shape the way I view the world and the way the world may view me that are invisible to you. They may be things like my religious beliefs or my family status, the number of siblings that I had, where I was born, where I live now, my educational history, my health history, the mood that I'm in, my values, my motivation. All of these things make up my identity, my culture, and shape the way I view the world and the way the world views me. Here are some other examples of characteristics that have been mentioned by other participants of our workshops that may fall below, or even some may argue above the waterline as well. And let me tell you why this is important before I invite you to do an exercise on your own here. How well can you really truly know me? How close of a relationship can we form by you knowing only that I talk quickly and with my hands and have light skin and short hair? Not very well. The key is to be able to lower the waterline for me to show up more fully so we can create a deeper, more authentic working relationship. And that doesn't happen by just inviting your mentoring partner to show up more fully. It starts by you moving first, whether you're the mentor or the mentee, by you sharing authentically, by you creating this environment where it is comfortable sharing with one another. So here's what I would like for you to do. I want to invite you to think about your own cultural iceberg. What are the elements that are visible above the waterline that people can see, but that are significant enough to shape the way the world views you and the way you view the world? And what are the elements below the waterline that are invisible to people who don't know you right away, but who that are invisible to people who don't know you well, but that shape the way you view the world and that are important for somebody to know if they are going to get to know you and create an authentic relationship. And after you've taken a moment to complete your iceberg, to write all of these various elements of your identity above and below the waterline, what I want you to do is I want you to select one item from above the waterline and two from below the waterline that you think will shape how you show up in the world and that might impact your mentoring relationship. So one that's visible, two that are invisible. And I'd like for you to think through the impact of those on your mentoring relationships. If you're not currently in a mentoring relationship, think through the impact on your professional relationships. And I want you to think through what can you do to lower the waterline and avoid misunderstanding. I'm going to pause for a few moments so you can complete this exercise. I'll give you about 30 seconds more to record some thoughts here. Okay, I realize you may not have had a chance to complete this exercise, but I want to encourage you to do that after this webinar. And once you've taken the time for self-reflection, I want to also invite you to engage in this exercise with your mentoring partner. Ask them to do the self-reflection, and you might have a conversation about why you chose the items that you chose. This will be a way to begin to have conversations about the details, so the details aren't just the details, as Charles Ames says. It will be a way for you to create a deeper connection and start to invite conversations about differences into your mentoring relationship. Here's what we know. We know that good conversation can only grow on a foundation of safety and trust. And so in your mentoring relationships, you want to create that foundation of safety and trust by having good conversation. So let's talk about some ways to do that. And I want to do that through a model that we call the 5 levels of conversation, the 5 levels of conversation. And in these 5 levels, they evolve along the continuum. As they evolve, you have greater learning, greater trust is present, and they tend to evolve with the passage of time. So let's talk about each of these levels. Well, the first level of conversation actually isn't really a conversation at all. It's a monologue. And in mentoring relationship, this might show up as the mentor talking at the mentee. In my day, this is how it was done. This is what I think you should do, or this was my experience. Let me tell you all about it. What do you think? Right? There's no interaction back and forth. There's no real learning or trust that is involved. And often this happens early in the relationship because there has not been the establishment of a rapport or the invitation to really engage. So the first level of conversation is monologue. The second level of conversation is transaction. In transaction, there's a little more give and take, but it actually feels a lot more like a checklist. So if I were to give you a visual for monologue, it would be like this, a mentor talking at a mentee. And a transactional relationship, it would be the visual of a checklist. It might look something like the mentor saying, well, last time we talked about going to meet with 3 people and asking them about how they create influence within the organization. Did you do that? Yes. And the next thing that we talked about was creating a learning plan from that. Did you do that? Yes. Where it's really more of a accounting or a reporting in instead of this true deep engagement about learning. You can see there's a little more back and forth. Maybe it requires a little more accountability, but there's not a lot of trust or learning that is required in the transactional stage. So if the visual for a monologue is somebody talking at somebody and the visual for transaction is a checklist, the visual for interaction is like ping pong, like a ping pong table, right? With the mentor and the mentee kind of batting the ball back and forth. There may be more levels there may be some questions here from the mentee. There may be a little bit more engagement, but there's no deep learning. So maybe the mentor says, okay, did you follow up on the learning? Yes, I did, says the mentee, and here's who I talked to. Great, says the mentor. What's the next thing? And it just becomes back and forth without this deep level of learning. Where I would like to see you take your mentoring relationships is out and away from the ping pong table into collaborative engagement and dialogue. In collaborative engagement and in dialogue, there's a deeper learning. There are insights happening. Collaborative engagement, there is insights that are happening on the part of the mentee. The mentee, again, the mentor may say, did you talk to the 3 people about influencing? And the mentee might say, yes, I did. And I had this experience and it leads me to this question or leads me to this insight. And the mentor is able through curiosity, through questioning, to draw out insights of the mentee. The sweet spot of where it would be fantastic to take your mentoring conversations is into collaborative engagement, from collaborative engagement to dialogue. In dialogue, there's insights happening on both sides here. Maybe the mentee says, yes, and I had this question and it led me to think through this. And the mentor says, you know what? In you exploring that issue, it makes me think about something that I need to learn too. It makes me think about something that I'm doing here. And I wonder how this might land. And then there becomes this beautiful back and forth that's generative of learning and conversation. So let me ask you, though this recording, by the way, is being pre-recorded, this webinar is being pre-recorded, I am attending live in the chat and monitoring the chat. So I want to ask you to contribute in the chat and share with me, think about your most important mentoring relationships. And if you're not in a mentoring relationship currently, think about your most important professional relationships. What level are those conversations? Are they in monologue? Are they in transaction? Are they in interaction? Or are they in collaborative engagement or in dialogue? Share with me where you think those conversations are. Where are those conversations? And I'll give you a few seconds to do that. What level are your conversations at now? And what can you do to increase learning and increase trust so that you can move your conversations to collaborative engagement and dialogue? I want you to know that it takes time. It takes time to get to collaborative engagement and dialogue. And so giving it time is really important. Having the intentionality to get there is really important. Lowering the waterline will help you get there. But it's also important to remember that your conversations will only be as deep and as meaningful as the level of safety and trust that you have created. And taking the time to create rapport, to create inclusion in your mentoring relationships will help you get them to collaborative engagement and dialogue. I love this analogy that actually many years ago my husband raised to me about the levels of conversation being analogous to an apartment building. There are lobby level conversations, the kind of conversations that you have when you run into somebody in the lobby. How's the weather? How was your weekend? What are you doing tomorrow? Maybe even how's the family? It would be highly inappropriate to run into somebody in the lobby and ask them what their goals are in life or what some of the elements of their identity are that shape how they see the world. You have to first be in the lobby before you move up the elevator to the first floor, second floor, third floor, where you can begin to have more detailed, meaningful conversations that are deeper. And collaborative engagement and dialogue don't happen in the lobby. Collaborative engagement and dialogue happen in the upper floors. So you really need to take the time to begin to developing them. So once you've shared what levels are your conversations currently, I want to invite you to share in the chat, what can you do to get to or to stay in dialogue? Let's hear some of your thoughts in the chat. What can you do to get to or to stay in dialogue? Do share in the chat and I will respond in the chat as well. Wonderful. Okay. So in order to foster trust and safety, you have to, as I say, use behavior and action. So I want to talk to you about what some inclusive behaviors are that help you really learn from difference. And so those I've summarized here into 8 inclusive behaviors. The first 4 are about awareness. The second 4 are about action. So let me talk about each of these. The first inclusive behavior is to exercise enough humility to recognize that my normal may not be your normal. Normal can be very subjective. So what might feel normal to you, what might feel appropriate for you, may not be appropriate for me, and vice versa. So having the humility of your own cultural perspective to recognize that someone else may have different views about what is normal and appropriate. Really important awareness as a measure of inclusive behavior. Number 2, I would call this one intent versus impact. It's so interesting that we judge our own actions by our intention, and we judge other people's actions by their impact. Let me say that one more time. We judge our own actions by our intent, and we judge other people's actions by their impact. Instead, I want to invite you to have curiosity, to be curious about somebody else's intent, and to be curious about the impact of your action. It may be true that you have a positive intention for something, but the impact may be negative. It's important not to deflect that impact by saying, I didn't mean it, but to get curious about why might it have had that impact, and to really own the impact of our own behavior. And the flip side of that is, instead of ascribing a negative intent when the impact is different, is to assume positive intent of somebody else when the impact is different. So it's about having the curiosity about the impact when it's when it's your action, and the curiosity about intent when it is somebody else's action. Really important inclusive behavior that requires awareness and the exercise of curiosity. The third inclusive behavior is to be aware of your feelings and your thoughts. Stay present to your experience. That requires vulnerability. That requires thinking through your own cultural iceberg. That requires getting attuned with your feelings, which is not something we often are in touch with when we're thinking about professional relationships. So being aware of your feelings and thoughts and staying present to your experience. And this last one under awareness is a great takeaway for all of you. I call this name a dynamic. Name the dynamic. And it requires courage. It requires courage in calling out the unspoken behavior that you are curious about. So let me give you an example of where this might be applicable. Have you ever been in a conversation or a meeting where the person you're talking to, maybe it's your mentee, their body language changes, their behavior changes, their energy changes. Maybe they sit back and cross their arms. Maybe they get really quiet and you can see they're processing. Instead of letting that go and saying, they'll share with me when they'll share with me their thoughts if they wanted to, maybe you can say, I wonder what that's about. And you can say, gosh, Lisa, I noticed that you sat back in your chair. Tell me what's going on. Or I noticed you got quiet. Tell me what you're thinking. Calling out the dynamic helps build trust, helps invite conversations. Those are the 4 inclusive behaviors about awareness. Let's move to the 4 inclusive behaviors about action. Sharing airspace. What does that mean? Making sure that you're not the only one talking. Making sure that you're spending time listening and talking, that you're sharing the space with someone else. And sharing airspace doesn't mean just letting other people talk. It means creating space so other people can think and process in your conversations. The next action, be open to feedback and ask clarifying questions. Be open to feedback and ask clarifying questions. Make sure that you're asking questions to see how the things you talk about land or are received by the person with whom you're meeting, by your mentee or by your mentor. Be open to feedback from your mentee or from your mentor. Speak for yourself and share your own lived experience. This is so critical, especially when we're talking about difference. Remember that nobody's experience is going to be identical to somebody else's, and assuming that somebody else's experience is the same can be really detrimental. Speak only for yourself. Share your lived experience, and then get curious about your mentoring partner's experience there. And finally, stay in conversation. Be in relationship with your mentoring partner. If you can't meet regularly, maybe you make sure that you send a text or an email or an article or a title of a book or a podcast recording, something to stay connected. Maybe it's a quick direct message that says, I know you had that important meeting. What's that all about? Or I know you had an important meeting. How did it go? And so really making sure that you're staying connected and staying in relationship is a really important inclusive behavior. So you see here 8 inclusive behaviors that can help you build trust in your mentoring relationship. Okay, we've talked about leaning forward into difference. We've talked about learning from difference. And now I want to talk about the third pillar, which is leveraging difference. Leveraging difference helps you get up that escalator. It helps you get closer to the land of inclusion through taking what you've learned and really moving that into action. And so there's 4 elements of leveraging it that I want to speak with you about today. Perspective shifting, building competency, providing support, vision, and challenge, and expanding the pie. Let's talk about each of those. First, let's talk about perspective shifting. One way to leverage difference is to work to shift your perspective. And it happens only after you've learned about difference, because you really begin to notice some of the differences between you and your mentoring partner. Remember too that I didn't want to back up for just a second, because I want you to recognize that we can connect over our differences, not despite our differences. We can use the differences between us as a way of learning, a way of valuing one another. But one thing you have to do is to be willing to shift your perspective. And those of you with coaching backgrounds know a lot about perspective shifting questions already. Perspective shifting questions in mentoring are about using these kind of questions to test your assumptions, to move your mentoring conversations forward. And it's by asking questions of yourself and of your mentoring partner like these. What lens am I looking at this through? How am I viewing this problem? How might someone else see it? What consequences do you foresee of that action? So this is really applicable if you and your mentee agree on a particular course of action, to help them play it out and to shift your perspective. What consequences do you foresee? Use this next question, how is it different for you, if you find, particularly as a mentor, if you find yourself in telling mode, if you catch yourself in monologue or in story sharing. There's nothing wrong with story sharing, but make sure that you end your story with a perspective shifting question. That's how it was for me. How might it be different for you? I always like to say that if you're telling a story, make sure it ends with a question mark. And then here's the final perspective shifting question. Although there are dozens more, this is just 5 for you to consider using. What am I missing? You use this, here's how I see it. Here's what I think a possible idea might be. What am I missing? Really testing that. Mentors and mentees can use that question. So those are some perspective shifting questions. As you think about leveraging difference, I want you to think about the importance of finding your native genius. Native genius is a term that was coined by Liz Weissman and by Kristen Wheeler in their work on native genius. And native genius is the intersection of your ability and your desire. The intersection of what you're good at and what you most love to do. And it is a mentor's job to help a mentee discover and leverage their own native genius. And through perspective shifting questions, through recognizing difference, asking questions that get to that intersection of what do they love and what are they most good at will help them discover their native genius. We know that culturally competent people bridge difference. And the second way really of leveraging difference is about building competency. So I want to talk to you about our model it's not our model, it's a model that was developed by Milton Bennett many years ago. It's the Modified Developmental Model of Intercultural Sensitivity, the DMIS. And it talks about, and it illustrates how you can build cultural competency through a continuum. So let me talk to you a little bit about that. According to Bennett, and this I should say has been tested across cultures, across industries, there are 5 stages of cultural competency. The first stage is denial. In denial, you miss difference entirely. Not everybody starts at this stage, but if you are at this stage, you really don't see or notice differences. This is most likely to occur at a relatively homogeneous environment. But the first stage is denial. The next phase is polarization. In polarization, you see differences, but you judge those differences as better or worse or better. Preferable, less preferable. I like or I dislike. So again, you're seeing differences. So it's an advancement from the denial stage, but you're judging those differences. That's polarization. The next phase, if I were to draw these to scale, I would draw minimization perhaps as the biggest phase. In minimization, you de-emphasize differences. You see differences, but you don't think that those differences make a difference. And in fact, so many of us in the working world are in this stage because we've been trained and raised to be in this phase. We think about our shared humanity and we minimize those differences. But the problem with minimizing differences, the problem with de-emphasizing differences, is that you can't leverage the beauty of those differences. You can't reap the rewards that we talked about earlier of having a more diverse and inclusive environment. And if you are feeling other, if you are feeling not a lack of sense of belonging or a sense of difference, you feel like an outsider and less inclined to contribute in an environment where there is minimization. Note that if you are in denial, polarization, or minimization, you are viewing differences through your own cultural lens. But as you move forward on the continuum to acceptance, in acceptance, you recognize that there are differences. You don't yet know how to walk the talk. You don't yet know how to bridge those differences, but you recognize that there are differences that make a difference. You can then move to adaptation, where you start to learn ways to bridge those differences through curiosity, through non-judgment. And you'll note that acceptance and adaptation, you begin to view differences through the lens of other cultures. It doesn't mean that you know all of the customs in every culture around the world, or even in the culture of your mentoring partner or your most significant professional relationships. But it means that you have enough of an awareness that there might be a difference to start to get curious about it. Okay, so that's building competency. The next way you can leverage difference is by providing support, vision, or challenge. We know that mentees are looking for three things from their mentor. They're looking for their mentor to support their growth and development. They're looking for their mentor to help them develop, crystallize, and realize their career vision. And they're looking for their mentor to challenge them in a way that will facilitate their growth and development. Mentees, if you're a mentee and on this webinar, it's important for you to know these three elements so that you can help your mentor determine how to provide support, vision, and challenge for you. So I want to invite you to take the time after this webinar to consider, how might you support your mentee's growth and development? Or mentees, how might you ask your mentor to support your growth and development? Sometimes it's by providing structure, by providing resources, by providing accountability, by being a safety net or a place you can role play certain conversations or practice certain presentations, by providing connections and opening up your own network for your mentee. All ways that you could provide support. How might you provide vision? How might you help your mentees? How might you ask your mentors to help you crystallize and realize a career vision? Maybe it's by, again, sharing contacts. Maybe it's by sharing your perspective from different roles, or talking about brainstorming together, thinking together about what things might look like 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the line, or even tomorrow or next year. And thinking about what are the things that you might be doing, what are the possibilities, that kind of thing. Okay, expanding the horizon. That's what vision is all about. And finally, challenge. What things can you do to challenge your mentee or mentees? How can you ask your mentors to challenge you in a way that are going to facilitate your growth and development? It's critical in mentoring to step out of your comfort zone, both for mentors and for mentees. And the challenge is all about, I like to say mentors push and mentees stretch. It's all about the mentor pushing the mentee out of their comfort zone, but providing that safety net and sounding board by taking risks, trying new things, doing new assignments, doing something that's a little bit scary, and using the safety of your mentoring relationship to go forward. All right. Finally, a way to leverage difference is to think about the pieces of the pie. Pie, P-I-E, is an acronym. It's an acronym for the three elements of career success: performance, image, and exposure. Performance, image, and exposure. So oftentimes if I'm conducting a workshop, I will show this slide without the percentages attached. And I will ask people if they were to guess what percentage of career success is performance accountable for, how well you do your job. They're usually surprised that it's only 10%. In fact, what studies show is it is table stakes, meaning it is essential. It is an essential 10%, and you can't reap the benefits of image and exposure if you're not good at your job. But as it turns out, I can be better at my job than somebody else who has more exposure to resources and opportunities, or is more favorably viewed within an organization, and they will have more career success than I will. What we know is that a supervisor can focus on performance, a coach can focus on performance, but to really assist your mentees to really get the value out of mentoring, I want to invite you to work with your mentoring partner on exposure and images. Exposure and image. Exposure, your exposure to people, resources, and opportunities, and your image, how you're viewed within an organization. Not so that you can fit into the mold, but so you can identify how you want to be viewed within an organization, and your mentor can give you feedback so that you can be viewed in the way that you want to be viewed authentically. So focusing on exposure and image is critical in mentoring relationships. As we come to the end of our time together, I want to invite you to ask questions within the chat. I want to invite you to, and I'm attending this as well and will be responding. I love this quote by Wayne Dyer. He said, "When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change." What a beautiful concept to invite you to expand your perspective, to invite you to take action, to move from the land of status quo to the land of inclusion in your mentoring relationships, to begin to invite conversations about difference into your mentoring relationships so that you can enhance the quality of your mentoring relationships. Let me ask you to do the following. In the chat box, please share one thing from this workshop that you want to be sure to remember 1 month from now. One thing that you want to be sure to remember 1 month from now. Please share that in the chat. I look forward to responding to that. Keep those comments coming. And I want to thank you. Thank you for attending. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your participation. Thank you for your commitment to mentoring. And please don't hesitate to reach out if I can be of service to you. We have a free e-letter with lots of resources on mentoring, and I hope you'll take advantage of that as well. Be well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for your wonderful sharing. And you shared a lot of tools actually that are very helpful for not only for our mentoring, but for working and the life. And you used a lot of analogies. I personally like them very much, like apartment building, ping pong, iceberg. And it gives us a lot of thoughts. And now let's come into the Q&A. 如果各位朋友有问题，可以把那个问题可以先来提问。Zoom 里的朋友可以直接，比如说麦克风提问，或者是把问题发在聊天框里。其他平台的朋友如果有问题的，可以把问题反馈给我们的工作人员。我们的工作人员呢会把这些问题收集起来，问到我们的嘉宾。Lisa, there are 2 questions in the chat box.
Yes, I see. Yes. I see that Jack asked. Yes. Yeah, he says, "I'm a lifetime learning seeker. It seems higher levels of conversation are helpful for my learning, but my conversations are mostly at a level 1 or 2. How can I move to higher levels, especially when I'm not good at driving conversations to go deeper?"
That's the first question. 我们第一个问题说，我是一位终身学习者，然后我是一个追求终身学习的人，然后根据刚才就是演讲嘉宾的发言，我发现可能更高层次的对话更有助于我的学习。就是我自己的对话呢，经常呢只停留在1或者是2的级别，大概就是可能像独白或者是事务性的对话。那我如何能够说走到更高层次的这个谈话级别？特别是因为我平常在沟通中可能不擅长去说主动的去掌控这个对话，也不能说让对话走得更深入。那我我应该怎么做？
That's a great question, Jack, and I love that you're a lifelong learner. That's the first step. See, why don't you translate? Yeah.
这个问题问得非常好，我也非常乐意回答。
So when you think about going deeper in conversations, it requires time and it requires the development of trust. So one way to think about it is, in order to be able to go deeper, how are you in ending trust and in showing trustworthiness?
所以这个问题呢，首先，因为如果你想说让你的对话更深入的，那你首先要可能像有2个方面的问题。第一个是需要时间的，第二个是你要对话进行更深入的话，一定是需要建立在2者之间的信任这个基础上的。那你想一想，你跟对方对话的时候，你们俩这个目前的信任度是怎样的？
Really are 3 factors that helpful to think about when you're thinking about how do you develop trust. And those factors are ability, benevolence, and integrity.
我们要如果跟对方建立很高的这个信任度，那要具备3个方面的要素。第一个是能力，第二个是你跟对方交流的时候你展现的这个友好，第3个是你跟对方沟通的时候你展现的真诚。
So if you are looking to establish trust, you want to demonstrate to your mentoring partner or the person with whom you're having the conversation that you have the ability to do your job. So for a mentor or a mentee, that would be your ability to show up in the mentoring relationship. That you have the benevolence, meaning that you're looking out, you have the relationship at its, you have the best interests of the relationship in your heart, and the integrity that you do what it is you say you're going to do. You follow up on your mentoring commitments, you follow up on your commitments to one another.
具体一点呢，就是第一个能力，比如说你跟你的就是那个对话者在沟通的时候，你要展现的是你的比如说工作方面能力。那如果是导师或者是学员，那需要展现的就是你能够多大程度的去展现出真实的自己这个能力。那第二个要素友好，友好就是说你们在过程当中你们都能够就是以对方的利益，就是我们双方的利益都能够谨记在心，因为你不能说就只看自己的利益而伤害了别人的利益，那对方的利益同样也非常重要。第3个是真诚，真诚就是说你在整个导师辅导关系过程当中，你要时刻的遵守你们之间做过的承诺，然后你同时要保持言行上的一个统一。
In addition to those 3 things, it's helpful to think about building the relationship, about getting curious and asking questions. If you exhibit the ability, the benevolence, and the integrity, you'll be able to go deeper in your mentoring conversations.
这个呢，其实想让你们的对话更深入，它其实本质上是一个说你们2者之间关系建立的问题。在建立一个良好关系的基础上，你要时刻的保持这个好奇心，然后能持续的向对方提问。所以你同时具备了这个能力，然后跟对方的友好以及真诚，那么你就能将你的对话就是推得更深入。谢谢 ，Thank you. And the second question from Catherine.
The second question from Catherine says, there is a saying that we should seek the common while respecting the differences. Maybe we've ignored the value of differences. I shared, that we can learn from and leverage the differences. It sparks a lot of thought. And then Catherine asks, how can we get rid of the biases in our heads to learn from and leverage the difference?
第二个问题呢是说，因为我们就经常说一句话，就是求同存异。我们可能在这个过程当中，我们往往忽视了这个差异的价值。那刚刚就是 Lisa 女士她分享了，比如说我们其实完全可以从这个差异当中去学习，去利用这份差异，就是为我们所用。这个呢引发了我很多思考。那我想知道我们如何能够就是面对差异的时候，抛开我们脑海里可能一些固有的偏见，然后能够去真正的就是利用学习这些差异。
So Catherine, it's a great question. And I have bad news for you and I have good news for you. The bad news is that we all have biases that shape the way that we see people, and it can be very difficult to get rid of those biases. But the good news is that with awareness and with curiosity, we can begin to overcome those biases.
Catherine 非常感谢你的问题。那首先呢，有一个好消息，一个坏消息。坏消息是，确实我们每个人都会有偏见，特别是我们来看待别人的方式的时候，我们有时候其实很难转变这种我们对待别人的这种看法。好消息是我们是可以去抛弃这样的偏见的。比如说，我们可以两方面，第一个是提高自己的意识，第二个呢是保持好奇心。
The first step really is self-awareness of making sure that you are aware of the things that make you unique. You think through those things shape the way you view the world. To do that, you can begin to notice these differences and notice when you're judging those differences instead of being curious about those differences.
那第一个就是关于自我意识。当我们具备足够的自我意识的时候，就是当我们知道是什么让我们可能觉得自己是独一无二的，觉得自己哪些地方是独特的，跟别人不太一样的，看看是什么影响着我们看待这个世界周围的这个方式。通过这种就是更可以让我们更注重我们跟其他人之间的差异，也特别是能够意识到我们在评判这些差异的时候，我们的想法是怎样的。
So if you think about the model of cultural competency that I shared, when you're judging those differences, you're in polarization. You're viewing differences as better or worse. The key is to move farther along on the continuum and start to get curious about what is the impact of this difference? How might it impact the person whom I'm talking to? And to start to build trust so you can have these curiosity conversations without judgment. And you can be in wonder, meaning you can really wonder about these differences and start to have conversations about them. Once you have conversations about them, you're able to move past judgment.
我们讲了一个文化能力的模型，这是如何我们在是对这个我们跟别人之间的差异，我们在做评判的时候，其实我们往往处于一个两极分化的状态，就是我们看待事情，要么就是可能就是是与非，或者是好与坏。那关键呢是时刻保持心一个好奇的状态，你好奇就是这样的差异，它可能比如说是如何影响到别人的，然后它有什么样的影响，它是如何影响到别人的。那我们就是在可以抛弃这样评判这种评价的差异的方法的时候，抛开这种偏见，我们可以就是把我们的对话推得更深入一些。
It can also be helpful to connect when you're finding yourself feeling divided. It can be helpful to look for commonalities. When you're finding yourself wondering about differences, it can be good to be curious about those differences. So it's not it's not do we connect over the things we have in common or over the ways that we're different. It's an and. We connect over the ways that we are over the things we have in common and over the ways that we're different. Both are important.
那第二个就是当你自己可能比如说从你们的这段关系或者对话中有点脱离，或者说你在对话过程当中就是不专心的时候，你要尝试继续重新的跟别人建立连接，跟自己周遭跟这个世界重新建立连接。你可以依然是通过保持这个好奇心，你去对别人对你们之间的差异保持好奇心，对周围的一切保持好奇心，再跟就是对方进行对话，这样呢就是更能够充分的去利用这个差异。
And the great news, Catherine, is that once you are aware
Thank you
of those,
for your answer.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
我这边我靠
Are you able to hear me? Wonderful. Sorry about that. The good news, Catherine, is that once you start to become aware of your differences, start to manage your biases, and you can start to become aware of when you're making judgments. And that's how, with time, patience, and curiosity, you can overcome those biases.
就好的消息是，当你特别是你能意识到你们之间存在的这种差异时，那这也是你能够去开始管理应对你这个偏见的时候，你就可以去投入你的时间，投入你的耐心，然后以及你的好奇心，然后管理这样的偏见，然后好的去利用这个差异。
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for your answering, and thank you, Catherine, for the question. Slack 是不是有问题？可以提问。
First, great speech, Lisa. A lot of insight and tools shared. And the next, I have to ask IC for translation. 接下来我来邀请你帮忙翻译一下。就是我感觉他讲的内容的背景应该 mentoring， 它是不是就只是企业内部？因为他有一 part 是在讲那个 coaching 和 mentoring 的区别嘛。我感觉他讲的很多的内容是不是面向于就是组织内部的这种 mentor， 然后这样才能发挥更大的，就是或者他讲到的那些功效。我第一个其实就是也比较封闭的问题，或者说组织外部的 mentor 这种实践可能的功效没那么强烈，或者我感觉没有个人的这种。第二个问题就是我感觉他讲的这个 mentoring 技术让我联想到现在比较流行的那个 DEI 这个概念嘛，组织中的它很好的帮助了这个 diversity 和 inclusion 这两个元素，但是在公平性的 equity 这块好像是没有链接性，没有那么强烈。所以我的疑问是关于 equity 是不是 mentor 的这个技术在组织内部的技术这支撑力，或者说怎么才能够，或者说 equity 是不是要靠系统的制度性 policy 的那种东西来给更强力的支持，而 mentor 的话 mentor 这种技术的话就不是很好的在这个维度来。我大概就是这两个，不知道艾希你能不能 get 到我的问题了？
可以，
我表达的清楚了吗？
可以。
Okay, 那你翻译吧。行 ，Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for sharing of a lot of insights and tools. And I wonder if your sharing about this mentoring is more targeted at the internal mentoring, within organizations, and does they work for the mentoring outside external mentoring? This is my first question. It seems like a closed question. And the second is about recently most of us always talk about the concept of DEI, the diversity, inclusion, and equity. And it seems that your sharing about mentoring is more closely connected to diversity and inclusion. I wonder for the equity part, does the mentoring is enough to support equity, or does the equity require some other things like policies or systems in the organization? Thank you.
Such wonderful questions. Thank you so much. So let me start with the first question. I deal with both mentoring internally and externally to organizations, and both work. And typically, when you are thinking about mentoring internally to an organization, it comes either in informal mentoring, meaning organically you develop a relationship with somebody outside of a mentoring program, or formally with a mentoring program.
像我刚刚讲的这个导师辅导，其实它对导师辅导和外部的导师辅导它是都有帮助的，因为内部的像有一些，比如说非正式导师辅导，可能更专注于一些比较可能人际关系这方面的。那么还有或就是导师辅导，它也是可以就是起。
So work fact, there are some studies that say that informal mentoring is informers see more results than formal mentoring cultures. But, and it's a big but, right? A big exception, that what we know is that when it comes to equity, when it comes to looking at creating equal access, you need to have a formal mentoring program because it to measure results, and it helps with access across, it helps with equity of access across populations.
比如说支持就是企业内部的这个公平这一块，就是像这个导师辅导呢，它比如说它是可以就是导师辅导，它比如说是不是给每个人它都能带来这样的好处。
Externally is most typically done informally, although there are some associations that have formal mentoring programs. I always encourage people to find a mentor internally to an organization and to find a mentor externally to an organization. We all can benefit from multiple mentors in multiple contexts. And so organization can be helpful for navigating your organization, and thinking about a mentor external to your organization can be helpful for navigating your career, your industry, and perspective.
找导师的时候，我们可以既找这内部导师，也找外部的导师。因为内部的导师的话，他可能更有我们这个企业里就是个人和组织的在内部的发展。那外部的导师的话，他可以拓宽一点来讲，比如说对于个人，他可能更有助于我们在事业上，就是未来的多维度的这个成功。那可能对于我们聚焦的行业也很有帮助。
To your second question about equity, You're exactly right. That equity cannot be achieved alone through mentoring alone. Equity must also be achieved through systems, through policy, and through systemic change.
关于第二个问题，关于这个公平的问题，你刚才疑问的点也是对的。我们不能只靠辅导，就是这个项目来支撑这个公平的话，其实是不够的。我们除了这个导师，然后其他的我们确实的体系、政策，包括这些系统性的变革都是有必要的。
I think a part of the reason that I'm such a fan of formal mentoring programs is that they can create equity in the access of relationships. They can help track the outcomes, create more representation at the higher levels. And mentoring programs can act in conjunction with these things that you mentioned, like policy, like systems change, to help to create change. So they all act in conjunction with one another.
个人是非常推崇这个正式的导师辅导的，因为正式的导师辅导，它是可以跟我们内部的这个体系政策相结合的，它是可以就是让每个人都能的就是公平的这样的辅导，这样的好处可以让每个人就是都能从这段关系当中去受益，同时呢也能够就是看就是这个导师辅它的效果怎么样，去衡量一下它的效果。
是。
有一个问题，有具体的使用边界吗？这个问题就是有没有其他的背景啊？我这边刚刚因为可能断网了，没有看到前面的这个对话，可以就是分享一下你的问题吗？开那个麦克风，或者是在这个聊天框里输入一下你的问题。My poor connection, and there is another question from Felix. 今天由于时间问题，就是 Felix， 你可以把你的这个问题等会儿就详细一点，包括这个问题的背景反馈给我们可以问题反馈给 Lisa， 然后 Lisa 她到时候回复给我们，我们这边再就是转告你。谢谢。That's a question from Felix about what you shared today. Are there any specific use cases and boundary for using what you shared?
He's asking about use cases. Can you repeat the question for me, IC, please?
Yes, about what you shared today as your specific use cases. Yes, and also about the boundaries for using those tools.
Yeah, so lots of use cases. In fact, there's quite a few studies that show now that mentoring promotes representation of women and minorities at the higher levels in management more than any other inclusion tool. There are a number of organizations that are using mentoring. In fact, we have a client we have been working with here in the United States. It's actually a global client that does have a presence in China as well, that has now scaled a enterprise-wide program where they are focusing the mentoring on diverse associates, people who have been traditionally underrepresented in the workforce, and they're pairing people across difference. They're in their 7th year of the program. They're seeing great progress, amazing results, and not just for mentees, for mentors who report that they are gaining better leadership skills, gaining more perspectives into the organization, and learning more about their organization and ways to be successful than they did prior to mentoring.
今天讲的这个，我们 Lisa 女士分享的这个话题，它就是有很多应用场景。其实，比如说这个提到包容这个话题，那我们比如说在有些可能组织内部，它出现一个，比如说对于少数群体这些人，他可能在比如说在管理层。他其实可能发声的权利就没有那么高，他是比如说可能是少数的群体项，比如说一些在管理层方面，可能女性管理层他就比较少。那他呢，这个导师辅导呢，更多的去帮助这些人可能提升他们的一个，比如说发声的权利，那就是让这个组织内部就更多的这个包容性和平等性。那很多组织也在使用这个方法，全球范围内，包括中国，我们也有很多公司是在用的。在具体的导师辅导，其实在内部我们也可以用来就体现为，比如说领导力，那提升领导者的这个领导力，或者是提升组织内部，我们可以通过这个导师辅导，如何让组织内部取得更多的这个成功这些方法。
And as to your second question about the boundaries for using these tools, remember the model of conversation where you can only proceed to the higher level of conversation with time and trust and learning. And so there is no limit to how you can use them so long as you and your mentoring partner have established the trust to have those conversations. So to use the apartment metaphor, you can't have a deep conversation about difference if you have a lobby level relationship. You have to be higher up and have more trust in order to have these deeper conversations.
关于这个使用边界的问题，我们举个例子，就刚才的这个对话层次那个模型，我们刚刚有讲到，如果你想比如说进行更高层次的对话，你需要花时间，你需要跟对方建立一个信任，你需要能从中学习，不断的学习。那一旦你们就是能够建立这个信任关系的时候，那其实这个边界的话其实有这个限制了。因为就像刚刚我们举的例子，如果你停在对话只停留在那个大厅层次的话，那你们就很难可能进一步去讲比如说更高层次的对话，你可能很难产生更多的见解。但是一旦你建立了足够的信任，你们的对话这个层次就是变得更高了，那你们就能够进行更深入的对话，然后能够更 Thank you. Let's have the final question from Rose.
What are the common challenges and measures that can be taken when creating an inclusive environment?
说就是我们在要去营造一个包容性的环境的时候，我们会遇到哪些就比较一些常见的挑战，那以及应对这些挑战我们能采取怎么样的措施
Question, and there are so many answers to that question that we couldn't possibly have time to answer them all. So I'm going to answer with just a few answers, but very incomplete because there's much I could share there.
答案呢可能就有很多的角度，那今天就是考虑到就是目前这个时间问题呢，我会从就是几个角度来讲。
The biggest challenge to creating an inclusive environment is that people don't move out of their silos. They don't take action. They only rely on their intention to create an inclusive environment instead of action.
挑战就是大家好像都就处在自己的这个孤岛上，因为大家就是不愿意采取行动，可能更多的是停留在意图上，是我愿意去这样的就是包容性的环境，我愿意去贡献这样的包容性环境，但仅仅是意图上，它并没有说从行动上来采取一个突破。
Is that the solution is not, but it is simple, and it is in exhibiting inclusive behaviors and in seeking out relationships with people who are different from you in some substantial way.
好消息，这个答案其实它是很简单，只不过是不太容易做到。就是我们一个是跟对方，我们比如说大家建立一个关系的时候，我们更多的是，比如说我们可以能够正视这个差异，能够知道它给我们带来的价值。这样的基础之上，在这样认知基础之上，我们跟大家去建立一个良好的关系。
And the other challenge is a fear of making a wrong move or causing offense in having conversations about difference. And a measure that can be taken there is really focusing on building trust in your mentoring relationships by using the ability, benevolence, and integrity model that we talked about before.
第二个挑战是我们可能在跟对方沟通的时候，我们其实会有一个担心，我们担心可能会引起冒犯。那这个就是又回到我们前面讲的一个，就我们要跟对方建立足够的信任。这个信任呢，就具备3个要素：第一个是能力，第二个是你对对方展现出足够的友好，第3个是表现出你的真诚。
Thank you for the great question.
Thank you. 非常感谢 Rose 提的这个问题，很棒。I think that's all for today's webinar, and thank you again, Lisa, for your time to deliver the webinar. And I think it brings a lot of thinking and a lot of valuable ideas. And thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the great questions.
Yeah, and now let me share my screen, and we'd like to get the feedback from the audience. Thank you for your time to attend this webinar. 非常感谢大家今天的参与。那我们 也希望能够得到大家的反馈。如果大家对我们今天的讲座就是有任何的意见，可以扫下方的2维码给我们留下一些宝贵的意见。这里我们也做一下下一期的我们讲座预告。下一期讲座预告是来自葡萄牙的 Maggie 女士，她是葡萄牙的认证和职业医疗教练，然后是 ICF 的大师级教练 MCC， 也是 ICF 葡萄牙分会的前会长。他同时也是认证的高管教练和教练督导。他给我们带来的话题呢，是我们导师辅导里也是一个比较常谈的话题，是空间，就是我们导师跟教练如何去为客户去维持这个空间。那下一期讲座是在下一周的3月14号，是晚上6点到7点。感兴趣的朋友可以扫右方的2维码报名加入我们。最后我们跟大家分享一个消息，是在我们是在今年的9月3号到5号，我们即将在瑞士达沃斯举办第2届组织隐性技能全球管理论坛。那感兴趣的朋友可以点击右方我们的官方网址，这个 3w.go-TKM.org， 可以去了解我们这个活动更多的信息，以及我们就是相关平时可能讲座，然后以及我们的演讲嘉宾还有其他的专家相关的信息都可以在上面看到。非常感谢大家今天的关注跟参与，我们下期见。今天的讲座就到此结束了，谢谢大家。Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, I see. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you, and I think it's your evening now, and have a sweet dream. Thank you.
Have a lovely day. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.